Most of what you think you know about the Middle Ages is a lie. You've been told they were dirty, lived in the Dark Ages, and thought the earth was flat. But what if I told you that almost every fact you learned in school was actually 19th century propaganda? Today, we're stripping away the myths to reveal the world as it actually was. We are diving deep into the biggest medieval lies we still believe today. From the truth about Viking horns to the shocking reality of medieval medicine. This is a journey into a past that is far stranger and more sophisticated than you ever imagined. Before we unlock the first secret, if you're a fan of long-form history that actually tells the truth, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Join our community of history seekers. Like this video to help the algorithm find more people like you. And tell me in the comments, what's one historical fact you've always been suspicious of? Chapter 1. The biggest medieval lie: people back then were stupid. Diga ribu kata. For a long time, modern people have comforted themselves with a simple idea that people in the Middle Ages were stupid. We imagined dirty peasants who never bathed, doctors who knew nothing, priests who believed every superstition, and kings who ruled purely by ignorance. We picture a world stuck in darkness, waiting to be rescued by modern intelligence. But this belief that medieval people were foolish is itself one of the greatest lies ever told. And like many medieval lies, it didn't begin in the Middle Ages. It began after them. The birth of a convenient lie, the idea that medieval people were unintelligent, was largely invented during the Renaissance and later exaggerated during the Enlightenment. Why? Because if you want to present yourself as advanced, rational, and superior, you need a dark past to compare yourself to. Calling the Middle Ages the Dark Ages made the present feel brighter. But darkness is not the same as stupidity. Medieval people were not stupid. They were limited by technology, limited by access to information, and limited by rigid social structures. Those are very different things. In fact, many medieval people were astonishingly intelligent. They memorized entire books because books were rare. They navigated oceans without GPS. They constructed buildings that still stand today without modern math software, steel reinforcement, or electric tools. And yet, despite this intelligence, medieval society believed many things that were profoundly wrong, not because people lacked brains, but because lies were baked into the system itself. Intelligence without freedom. To understand medieval lies, you must understand medieval life. Knowledge was controlled. Books were handwritten and expensive. Education was reserved for clergy and elites. Most people learned what they knew from sermons, folklore, and tradition. Questioning authority was dangerous. Truth was not discovered through debate. It was declared, and when truth flows only one way, even intelligent societies can believe absurd things for centuries. This is how lies survive, not through stupidity, but through structure. The cathedral builders. Consider medieval architecture. Gothic cathedrals like Notre Dame were engineering miracles. Builders understood load distribution, weight transfer, and structural balance, all without modern physics equations. Flying buttresses were not artistic accidents. They were solutions to real engineering problems. These builders experimented, calculated, failed, and learned. Does that sound like stupidity? Or does it sound like intelligence constrained by tools? Medieval medicine wasn't nothing. Another modern myth is that medieval doctors knew absolutely nothing. This is false. Medieval physicians studied anatomy using the best sources available to them, often ancient Greek and Roman texts. The problem wasn't that they refused to think. The problem was that they trusted the wrong authorities. If an ancient scholar said bloodletting worked, medieval doctors accepted it, not because they were stupid, but because questioning respected knowledge was considered arrogant and dangerous. Authority mattered more than evidence. And once that rule exists, lies can last for generations. Why lies felt safer than truth? Truth in medieval society was risky. If you challenged accepted beliefs, you could lose your job, your protection, or your life. If you accepted the lie, you stayed safe. So people adapted. They learned how to survive inside the lie. They repeated what they were told. They taught their children the same stories. They built entire worldviews around ideas that were never tested. Over time, the lie became reality. Not because people were incapable of thinking, but because thinking freely was punished. The lie that still comforts us today. Calling medieval people stupid does something dangerous. It allows modern people to believe. We are too smart to fall for lies. But history proves the opposite. Smart societies fall for lies all the time. Not because of intelligence, but because of fear, authority, convenience, and repetition. The medieval world believed lies for centuries. So has the modern world. Different lies, same mechanism, and that is the real lesson medieval history teaches us. Chapter 2. The Four Humours. The medical lie that controlled medieval life for 1,500 years. For more than 1,000 years, nearly everything Europeans believed about the human body was based on a single idea that was completely wrong. This idea did not come from observation, experiments, or repeated testing. It came from ancient authority, and once it entered medieval society, it became untouchable. The idea was called the Four Humours, and it shaped how people understood health, sickness, personality, morality, and even fate itself. According to this belief, the human body was governed by four internal fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health meant balance, illness meant imbalance. And because this system felt logical, symmetrical, and ancient, medieval society trusted it without question. Doctors didn't ask whether it worked. They asked only how to apply it correctly. And once that happened, the lie became permanent. The Four Humours theory taught medieval people that every symptom had a simple explanation. A fever meant too much blood. Sadness meant too much black bile. Laziness meant excess phlegm. Anger meant yellow bile had taken control. The human body, according to this belief, was not a complex biological system, but a container that needed constant draining, adjusting, and correcting. This made medicine feel comforting and orderly. Doctors could explain everything, even when they understood almost nothing. If a patient worsened, it wasn't because the theory was wrong. It was because the balance had not yet been restored. This logic made the system impossible to to falsify. Any failure simply meant more treatment was required. More blood needed to be removed. More purging was necessary. More suffering was justified. Bloodletting became the most famous and deadly result of this belief. Medieval doctors routinely cut veins or applied leeches to drain blood from patients who were already weak, malnourished, and sick. People with infections, injuries, fevers, or even headaches were bled repeatedly. Some patients lost so much blood that they fainted or died. But even death did not disprove the theory. Doctors believed the patient was simply too imbalanced to save. The lie protected itself. No outcome could challenge it. In fact, the worse the patient looked. The more confident doctors became that they were doing the right thing. Pain was seen as proof that the treatment was powerful. Suffering meant progress. What made this lie so dangerous was not just its cruelty, but how deeply it was woven into medieval culture. The four humors were not only medical ideas, they were personality explanations. Someone cheerful was said to be sanguine, someone angry was choleric, someone sad was melancholic. These terms are still used today, even though the theory behind them is false. Medieval people genuinely believed your personality, intelligence, morality, and destiny was shaped by invisible fluids inside your body. You were not sick because of bacteria or viruses. Those concepts did not exist. You were sick because your inner balance reflected a moral or natural failure. Illness became something personal, something shameful, something that revealed who you truly were. This belief system also made medieval medicine incredibly resistant to change. Doctors were trained by reading ancient texts, not by questioning them. If Galen or Hippocrates said something centuries earlier, medieval scholars treated it as truth, not hypothesis. Observing real patients mattered less than respecting tradition. And because medical knowledge was controlled by elite institutions, alternative ideas rarely survived. Even when treatments clearly failed, the system adjusted the explanation instead of questioning the foundation. The lie endured not because it worked, but because it was protected by authority, education, and fear of being wrong. The most unsettling part is that this medieval medical lie did not disappear when the Middle Ages ended. Bloodletting continued well into the modern era. Even in the 18th and 19th centuries, respected physicians still believed draining blood could cure disease. The idea survived longer than the society that created it. And that is the real lesson of the four humors. Bad ideas do not die when they are proven wrong. They die only when societies learn how to question authority without fear. Medieval people were not unintelligent for believing this lie. They were trapped inside a system where truth was inherited, not discovered. And once a lie becomes tradition, it can survive for centuries, even while killing the people who believe it. Chapter 3. God caused disease, the deadliest medieval lie of all. When disease spread through medieval Europe, people did not ask how it happened. They asked why they deserved it. One of the most powerful and destructive medieval lies was the belief that illness came directly from God as punishment for sin. This idea shaped how people reacted to sickness, death, and suffering for centuries. And nowhere was this lie more devastating. Then during the Black Death, instead of looking for physical causes, medieval society turned inward, convinced that plague was a moral verdict rather than a biological disaster, and once disease was framed as divine judgment, the search for real solutions stopped completely. The Black Death did not arrive quietly. It swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing nearly half the population in some regions. Entire towns disappeared. Families vanished in days. But despite the overwhelming scale of death, medieval people rarely questioned the belief that God was responsible. Priests preached that plague was sent to cleanse society of corruption. Sermons warned that repentance, not sanitation, was the only defense. People gathered in churches, prayed in crowded spaces, and participated in mass rituals, actions that, in reality, only accelerated the spread of disease. The lie felt comforting because it gave suffering a meaning. Random death was terrifying. Punishment felt understandable. Because disease was seen as a moral failure, fear quickly turned into blame. If God punished society, someone must be more sinful than others. Minority groups were accused of poisoning wells. Outsiders were attacked, expelled, or executed. Jewish communities, already marginalized, were massacred across Europe under the false belief that they had caused the plague. These accusations were not based on evidence. They were fueled by desperation and ignorance. The lie provided a target for fear. Instead of fighting disease, society fought itself. Violence replaced medicine. Hatred replaced understanding. Self-punishment became another horrifying consequence of this belief. Groups known as flagellants traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in hopes that pain would satisfy divine anger. Blood-soaked rituals filled public squares. People believed suffering could cancel sin, and that pain itself was healing. Meanwhile, real causes of plague fleas, rats, filth, and overcrowding remained untouched. Streets stayed dirty. Waste flowed openly. Bodies piled up without proper disposal. The lie did not just fail to stop disease. It actively prevented solutions from being considered. Medical progress became nearly impossible under this worldview. If illness came from God, studying it too closely could be seen as arrogance. Questioning divine will was dangerous. Doctors who suggested natural explanations risked being ignored or condemned. Even when patterns were visible, such as disease spreading faster in filthy, crowded areas, these observations were dismissed as irrelevant. The cause was spiritual, not physical. And so, society waited for forgiveness instead of prevention. Death became routine. Suffering became normalized. What makes this lie so disturbing is how long it survived. Even after the worst waves of plague passed, the belief that illness reflected moral failure continued to influence medicine, religion, and culture. People with disease were often shamed. The sick were isolated not just for safety, but for judgment. Compassion was replaced with suspicion. The lie taught people that being ill meant being unworthy, and traces of this belief still exist today. Whenever illness is blamed on personal failure rather than circumstance, the medieval belief that God caused disease was not born from cruelty. It was born from fear and lack of knowledge. People needed an explanation for suffering so massive that it felt unbearable. But once that explanation took hold, it became deadly. By turning disease into a moral issue, medieval society delayed real understanding for centuries. The Black Death did not only kill millions, it reinforced a lie that cost countless lives long after the plague itself faded. History remembers the Black Death as a natural disaster, but its true devastation was amplified by belief. And belief, when it replaces inquiry, can be just as lethal as any disease. Chapter 4. Astrology was science. When the stars controlled human lives, in the medieval world, the night sky was not something to admire quietly. It was something to fear, obey, and consult before making almost every important decision. One of the most deeply rooted medieval lies was the belief that the stars and planets actively controlled human lives. Astrology was not seen as superstition or entertainment. It was considered serious knowledge, closely connected to medicine, politics, religion, and destiny itself. Medieval people did not ask whether astrology was true. They asked only how accurately it had been interpreted. And once that belief settled into society, human choice slowly lost its meaning. Medieval astrology taught that every person was born under a specific cosmic influence. The position of planets at birth was believed to shape personality, intelligence, morality, and fate. Kings were crowned based on favorable alignments. Wars were delayed or launched according to star charts. Doctors refused to treat patients if the planets were in the wrong position. Even bloodletting was scheduled based on lunar cycles, because draining blood at the wrong time was believed to anger the cosmos itself. The universe was imagined as a massive machine, and humans were merely small pieces moving according to its design. Free will existed in theory, but rarely in practice. This belief system gave astrology enormous power. Astrologers advised rulers, influenced laws, and shaped public behavior. A bad harvest could be blamed on planetary imbalance. A failed marriage could be explained by incompatible stars. Personal responsibility slowly disappeared behind cosmic explanations. If something went wrong, it was not because of human error, it was because the heavens demanded it. This was comforting. It removed guilt, it removed uncertainty, and most importantly, it removed the need to question authority. If the stars had spoken, there was nothing left to debate. The danger of this lie was subtle but profound. By surrendering decision-making to astrology, medieval society learned to accept outcomes instead of challenging them. Poverty became destiny. Suffering became fate. Social status felt permanent. Because it was written in the stars, this belief discouraged change and justified inequality. If someone was born poor, sick, or unlucky, it was believed to be cosmically appropriate. Attempts to improve one's condition could even be seen as resisting the natural order. The lie did not just explain the world, it froze it in place. Astrology also blurred the line between observation and imagination. Medieval scholars carefully studied the sky, tracked planetary movements, and recorded patterns. But instead of using this data to understand natural laws, they used it to confirm beliefs they already held. Correlation was treated as causation. If something bad happened after a comet appeared, the comet was blamed. Contradictory evidence was ignored. Failed predictions were explained away as rather than false assumptions. The system protected itself by refusing to admit uncertainty. What makes this medieval lie especially unsettling is how familiar it still feels. Modern society may mock medieval astrology, yet millions of people today still turn to horoscopes, personality charts, and cosmic explanations for their choices. The language has softened, but the mindset remains. When people say it just wasn't meant to be, they echo the same surrender to fate that medieval astrologers promoted. The belief that external forces control outcomes can feel comforting, but it quietly weakens personal responsibility and critical thinking. Astrology did not survive for centuries because medieval people were foolish. It survived because it offered certainty in a chaotic world. It promised order where none was visible, but certainty built on false foundations always carries a cost. By trusting the stars more than observation, medieval society delayed scientific understanding and limited human agency. The sky did not control medieval lives, belief did. And when belief replaces evidence, even the most intelligent societies can mistake destiny for truth. Chapter 5. Pain purifies the soul. Why suffering was considered healing. In medieval society, pain was not merely tolerated, it was respected. One of the most enduring and damaging medieval lies was the belief that suffering itself was a form of purification. Pain was seen as meaningful, necessary, and even holy. If something hurt, it was assumed to be working. If life was difficult, it was believed to be morally correct. This idea shaped religion, medicine, law, and everyday behavior for centuries, quietly teaching people that comfort was suspicious and relief was dangerous. And once suffering was framed as virtuous, cruelty could be justified without guilt. This belief was deeply rooted in religious thinking. Medieval Christianity placed enormous emphasis on sacrifice, endurance, and imitation of suffering saints. Physical pain was associated with spiritual growth. The body was viewed as weak and corrupt, while the soul was eternal and pure. Therefore, harming the body was believed to strengthen the soul. Illness, hunger, poverty, and hardship were interpreted not as problems to be solved, but as tests to be endured. If someone suffered, it meant God was watching closely. If someone lived comfortably, it raised suspicion. This worldview made pain meaningful, and once pain has meaning, removing it can feel like a moral failure. Medical practices absorbed this belief completely. Treatments were intentionally harsh. Bloodletting was painful. Surgical procedures were done without anesthesia. Herbal remedies were often toxic and unpleasant. Doctors believed that strong reactions meant strong medicine. If a patient screamed, fainted, or worsened, it was interpreted as the body fighting impurity. Gentle treatments were dismissed as ineffective. Relief was not the goal, correction was, and correction required discomfort. The idea that healing should feel good would have sounded absurd to a medieval mind. This mindset extended beyond medicine into daily life. Fasting was common and often extreme. Self-denial was praised. Physical punishment was used not only in law, but in education and religious devotion. Children were disciplined harshly because pain was believed to teach obedience. Criminal punishment focused on public suffering, not rehabilitation. Executions were designed to be slow and visible. The most tragic result of this belief was how it shaped people's relationship with their own pain. Medieval individuals were taught not to question suffering, but to accept it. If life was unbearable, it was assumed to be deserved or necessary. Complaining about hardship could be seen as sinful. Seeking comfort could be interpreted as spiritual laziness. This discouraged people from improving their conditions or challenging injustice. If suffering was holy, then trying to escape it was dangerous. The lie kept people obedient, quiet, and resigned. Even compassion was distorted by this worldview. Helping the poor or sick was encouraged, but often without addressing root causes. Charity relieved guilt, not suffering. Pain was managed just enough to keep society functioning, but never eliminated. This allowed inequality to persist while still appearing morally righteous. The suffering of others became a backdrop to virtue, not a problem to solve. And because pain was framed as spiritually useful, there was little urgency to reduce it. What makes this medieval lie especially powerful is how long it survived, even as scientific understanding improved. The idea that suffering builds character remained deeply embedded in culture. Modern phrases like no pain, no gain echo medieval thinking. The suspicion of comfort, the glorification of struggle, and the belief that hardship automatically produces virtue all trace. Back to this worldview, pain can teach, but it does not purify. Suffering can shape people, but it does not make truth. Medieval society did not worship pain because it loved cruelty. It did so because pain gave meaning to a harsh and unpredictable world. When life offered little control, suffering felt like purpose. But purpose built on suffering comes at a terrible cost. By treating pain as sacred, medieval society delayed empathy, progress, and healing. And the lie endured because it felt noble. It made endurance feel like wisdom. In reality, it only made cruelty easier to accept. Chapter 6. Authority is truth. Why questioning knowledge was dangerous. In the medieval world, truth was not something to be discovered. It was something to be inherited. One of the most powerful lies shaping medieval society was the belief that authority itself defined what was true. Knowledge flowed downward, never upward. Ancient texts, religious leaders, and established institutions were considered correct by default, not because they had been tested, but because they had survived. To question them was not curiosity, it was rebellion. And rebellion carried consequences far beyond intellectual disagreement. Medieval education was built on reverence, not experimentation. Scholars studied texts written centuries earlier and treated them as complete and perfect. If an ancient author described the human body, nature, or the universe in a certain way, medieval thinkers assumed the description was accurate. Observation mattered less than interpretation. If reality conflicted with authority, reality was wrong. This created a system where errors could persist indefinitely, protected not by evidence, but by tradition. The older an idea was, the more untouchable it became. This belief shaped medicine, science, religion, and law. Doctors followed ancient medical texts even when patients died under their care. Astronomers adjusted observations to fit accepted cosmology. Theologians debated meanings within. scripture but rarely, questioned foundational assumptions. Knowledge became a closed loop, reinforcing itself through repetition. Truth was something memorized, not challenged. And because access to education was limited, most people never encountered alternative ideas. The lie became invisible. It felt natural. Questioning authority was dangerous because it threatened social stability. Medieval society depended on hierarchy. Kings ruled by divine right. Churches governed morality. Guilds controlled labor. Each layer relied on obedience to function. If people began questioning knowledge, they might begin questioning power. So doubt was discouraged, punished, or framed as heresy. Intellectual curiosity became risky. Silence became survival. Those who challenged accepted truths often paid a heavy price. Some were exiled. Some were imprisoned. Some were executed. Their ideas did not disappear because they were wrong. They disappeared because they were inconvenient. Progress slowed not because medieval people lacked imagination, but because imagination without permission was forbidden. The lie taught society that safety mattered more than accuracy. What made this belief so effective was how comforting it felt. Trusting authority removed uncertainty. It allowed people to believe that someone smarter, holier, or older had already figured everything out. Responsibility disappeared. Thinking became optional. This comfort came at a cost. Stagnation. When authority becomes truth, learning stops. Error becomes permanent. The effects of this lie lingered long after the Middle Ages ended. Even as new discoveries emerged, they were resisted if they conflicted with established belief. The habit of trusting authority over evidence proved difficult to break, and traces of it still exist today whenever ideas are accepted because of who says them, not because they are tested. Medieval society did not collapse under this lie. It functioned, it endured, but it paid for stability with progress. By teaching people that questioning knowledge was dangerous, the Middle Ages preserved order at the expense of truth. Chapter 7. Cleanliness Causes Disease. The Medieval Hygiene Lie. One of the strangest and most harmful medieval beliefs was the idea that cleanliness itself could make people sick. In a world without germ theory, medieval society developed a deep suspicion of bathing, fresh air, and even many believed that washing too often weakened the body, opened the skin's pores, and allowed disease to enter. Dirt, sweat, and strong smells were not necessarily signs of neglect. They were seen as protective layers. This lie shaped daily life, urban design, and personal habits for centuries, quietly turning filth into a form of safety. Medieval cities were crowded, poorly ventilated, and filled with waste. Human and animal refuse flowed through streets. Clean water was scarce. Yet, instead of recognizing filth as dangerous, people believed bad air, known as miasma, caused illness. Disease was thought to float through the air as invisible poison, and clean, open skin was believed to absorb it more easily. Bathing was feared because it softened the body. Warm water was especially suspicious. After major outbreaks of plague, public bathhouses were often closed, not because they were unsafe, but because people believed they made disease spread faster. The irony was brutal. the very practices that could have improved health were abandoned in the name of protection. This belief reshaped how medieval people treated their bodies. Many bathed only a few times a year. Clothing was worn repeatedly without washing. Perfumes and herbs were used to mask smells rather than remove their cause. Strong odors were believed to repel disease. While fresh scents were considered dangerous, people carried flowers or spices, not for hygiene, but to defend themselves against invisible air-based threats. Cleanliness became cosmetic rather than functional. The body was managed, not maintained. The hygiene lie also reinforced social inequality. Wealthy individuals could afford perfumes, layered clothing, and private spaces, which allowed them to appear clean without actually being hygienic. The poor, crowded into filthy housing, were blamed for disease outbreaks, even though the conditions affecting them were created by the same society that feared filth became normalized, disease became inevitable, responsibility disappeared into superstition. Even when evidence contradicted these beliefs, they persisted. Some communities noticed that people who lived near cleaner water sources survived longer. Certain occupations with better hygiene had lower mortality, but these observations were rarely connected to health. They were dismissed as coincidence. The belief system was too strong. Accepting as beneficial would have required admitting that centuries of tradition were wrong, and medieval society was built to resist that realization. The most tragic consequence of this lie was how it amplified catastrophe. During plague outbreaks, people sealed themselves indoors, avoided washing, and clung to contaminated clothing. Instead of reducing infection, these actions trapped disease within households. Rats thrived, fleas multiplied, and because the cause of disease was misunderstood, prevention remained impossible. The lie didn't just fail, it actively worsened every crisis. This belief did not disappear overnight. Suspicion of bathing lingered well into later centuries. Even as science advanced, cultural habits proved stubborn. Cleanliness had to be relearned, and this is the pattern medieval lies follow. Once a false belief becomes routine, it feels natural. It stops feeling like a choice. Medieval people did not reject cleanliness because they enjoyed filth. They rejected it because belief told them it was dangerous. History often portrays medieval hygiene as ignorance or laziness. In reality, it was obedience to a deeply held lie. The belief that caused disease did not arise from stupidity, it arose from fear and incomplete understanding. And like many medieval lies, it survived not because it made sense, but because it felt safe. Chapter 8. Violence creates order. Justice in the Middle Ages. Medieval justice was built on a simple and terrifying idea. Fear creates order. One of the most deeply embedded medieval lies was the belief that violence was not only necessary for justice, but essential for social stability. Punishment was not designed to correct behavior or protect society in the long term. It was designed to be seen, remembered, and feared. Pain was proof that justice had been served. Mercy was weakness. And once violence became the language of law, cruelty turned into tradition. In medieval society, law was public theater. Executions were held in town squares. Torture was conducted openly. Bodies were displayed as warnings. These acts were not hidden because shame was not associated with violence. Violence was associated with order. People were expected to watch. Children were brought to see criminals suffer so they would learn obedience early. The belief was simple. If punishment was terrible enough, crime would disappear. But instead of reducing crime, this system normalized brutality. Violence became familiar. Fear became routine. Torture was not merely punishment. It was also evidence. Medieval courts believed pain revealed truth. Confessions extracted under agony were treated as reliable. Even though suffering makes people say anything to make it stop, the lie that pain produces honesty justified unimaginable cruelty. Innocent people confessed to crimes they did not commit. Accusations became weapons. Justice became unpredictable, driven by fear rather than fairness. Once pain was accepted as a path to truth, truth itself became meaningless. This worldview also reinforced power structures. The law protected those who enforced it more than those subjected to it. Nobles often received lighter punishments than commoners. Public suffering was reserved for the powerless. Violence was framed as equal justice, but in reality it was selective. The lie masked inequality behind spectacle. Order appeared strong, even as fairness collapsed. The belief that violence maintained order discouraged reform. If society believed fear worked, there was no reason to search for alternatives. Prisons were rare. Rehabilitation was unheard of. Once someone was labeled a criminal, their suffering was considered necessary and deserved. This made cruelty efficient. It required no reflection, only repetition. What made this medieval lie endure was its emotional appeal. Fear feels effective. Immediate punishment looks decisive. Watching pain creates the illusion of control. But history shows that violence does not create order, it creates obedience. Resentment and silence. Medieval society mistook fear for stability and paid for it with endless cycles of cruelty. Even today, echoes of this belief remain whenever harsh punishment is praised simply for being harsh. Medieval justice teaches a clear lesson. Violence may silence people, but it never teaches them to be better. Order built on fear always demands more fear to survive. Chapter 9. Women were naturally inferior. The gender lie that shaped medieval society. One of the most enduring and damaging medieval lies was not about medicine, disease, or the stars, but about human nature itself. Medieval society widely believed that women were naturally inferior to men, weaker in mind, unstable in emotion, morally fragile, and intellectually incapable of authority. This belief was treated not as opinion, but as fact. It shaped laws, religion, education, medicine, and daily life. And because it was repeated constantly by institutions of power, it became invisible. The lie felt natural. Questioning it felt dangerous. This belief was reinforced by selective interpretations of religious texts and ancient philosophy. Medieval scholars often relied on classical authors who viewed women as incomplete or defective versions of men. These ideas were blended with theology to create a powerful narrative. Women were closer to temptation, closer to sin, and therefore needed control. Biology was misunderstood. Menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth were framed as evidence of weakness rather than complexity. Female bodies were treated as unstable, unpredictable, and morally suspicious. This medical misunderstanding justified social exclusion. Education reflected this lie clearly. Women were largely excluded from formal learning. Literacy among women was discouraged, especially outside religious institutions. Knowledge was considered dangerous in female hands. This belief also shaped medieval law. Women's legal identities were often tied to fathers or husbands. Property rights were limited. Testimony was sometimes considered less reliable. Violence against women was frequently minimized or ignored. Abuse was framed as correction. The lie normalized suffering by framing it as natural order. If women were inferior, their pain mattered less. Justice became unequal without appearing unjust. Perhaps the most horrifying consequence of this lie appeared during periods of social fear when disaster struck, famine, plague, political instability. Women were often blamed. Midwives, healers, and independent women became targets. Accusations of witchcraft were fueled by the belief that women were morally weak and easily corrupted. Thousands were tortured and executed not because of evidence, but because society needed someone to blame. The gender lie made persecution feel reasonable. Yet despite this systemic oppression, medieval history is filled with intelligent, capable women. Queens ruled kingdoms. Abbesses managed vast estates. Female scholars wrote, taught, and preserved knowledge within the few spaces allowed to them. Their existence directly contradicted the lie, which is why their stories were minimized or erased. The system could not afford visible counterexemptions. What makes this medieval lie especially powerful is how long it lasted. Ideas about female inferiority did not vanish with the Middle Ages. They evolved, softened, and adapted, but the core assumption survived. Even today, traces remain whenever competence is questioned based on gender or authority is treated as unnatural for women. Medieval society did not invent misogyny, but it institutionalized it. The lie that women were naturally inferior was not sustained by evidence. It was sustained by fear, fear of independence, fear of change, fear of losing control. And like all powerful lies, it survived by presenting itself as truth. Medieval society did not collapse because of this belief, but it limited its own potential. Half of its intelligence was restrained. Half of its voices were silenced. And history paid the price. Chapter 10. The greatest medieval lie of all. We are immune to believing lies. The most dangerous medieval lie was not about medicine, religion, hygiene, justice, or gender. It was the belief that once a society becomes advanced, it stops being vulnerable to falsehoods. Medieval people never thought of themselves as ignorant. They believed they were living according to truth, guided by wisdom, faith, and tradition. Their lies did not feel like lies. They felt like common sense. And that is precisely what made them powerful. The greatest medieval lie of all was not a single belief. It was the assumption that belief itself was no longer questionable. Every lie explored throughout medieval history followed the same pattern. Authority replaced evidence. Comfort replaced curiosity. Fear replaced inquiry. What makes this realization uncomfortable is how closely it mirrors the modern world. Technology has changed. Education has expanded. Information is everywhere. But the human mind remains the same. People still trust authority over evidence. They still cling to comforting explanations over uncomfortable truths. They still repeat ideas because they are familiar, not because they are tested. Medieval lies were not primitive mistakes. They were human mistakes. And humans have not evolved out of them. The Middle Ages teach us that intelligence does not protect a society from believing false things. Organization does not protect it. Faith does not protect it. Only curiosity does. Only the willingness to ask, what if we're wrong, creates progress. Medieval people rarely asked that question, not because they were incapable, but because the cost was too high. Questioning truth could cost your livelihood, your reputation, or your life. So silence became survival, and silence allowed lies to become permanent. History often frames the Middle Ages as a time before enlightenment, as if modern society is immune. But the real lesson of medieval lies is that every era believes it has reached the end of error. Every generation assumes it sees clearly, and every generation is wrong. The lies change, but the mechanism remains. Beliefs become identity. Doubt becomes threat, and truth becomes something people defend rather than discover. The Middle Ages were not uniquely foolish. They were uniquely honest about their fear. Life was short. Death was visible. Certainty was comforting. Belief offered structure in a world that felt uncontrollable. Modern society may reject medieval explanations, but it often seeks the same comfort through different means. Algorithms replace astrologers. Institutions replace churches. Experts replace priests. None of these are inherently wrong, but when they become unquestionable, the medieval pattern returns. The true danger of medieval lies is not that they existed, but that they feel distant. When history feels safely wrong, the present feels safely right. But the moment a society believes it cannot be deceived is the moment. Deception becomes effortless. Medieval people believed lies because they trusted systems that discouraged doubt. The moment we do the same, we step into the same trap. History is not boring because it is old. It is boring because it is repetitive. The same mistakes, dressed in different language, repeated across centuries. Medieval lies survived because they were comfortable, familiar, and protected by authority. And the only thing that ended them was not time, but questioning. The greatest lie is not what medieval people believed. The greatest lie is believing we are different.